A shelter worker was removing a cat's collar, routine procedure, when he felt something strange. A folded piece of paper, sewn into the lining by hand, and the last line read, "Please, don't let him think he was forgotten." This is the story of the note, and the cat who was still waiting. If this is your first time here, welcome to Paws and Whispers. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. The rain arrived before sunrise. It came in long, quiet sheets across the hills surrounding Brackenridge Hollow, tapping against the metal roof of the shelter with a steady, unhurried rhythm. The kind of sound that makes a person feel the weight of the morning before they've even finished their first cup of coffee. Lysander Hale stood at the small utility sink near the back of the intake room, washing his hands with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to everything he did. He had worked at the Brackenridge Hollow Animal Shelter for 11 years, and in that time, he had learned that rainy Fridays carried their own particular kind of heaviness. He dried his hands, folded the paper towel, dropped it in the bin. He picked up his clipboard. Bay 14. The cat had arrived 5 days earlier, brought in by a neighbor who had found him sitting on the porch of a house that had recently been vacated. No identification, no microchip, no response to handling. The intake form described him as a gray and white male, estimated age 8 to 10 years, quiet to the point of appearing non-responsive, refusing food, showing no signs of aggression, but equally no signs of engagement. He had been placed in the observation bay, given standard care, monitored. The days passed. He ate almost nothing. He did not interact. The space in Bay 14 was needed. The procedure was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Lysander walked down the corridor slowly. He always did on these mornings, not out of reluctance exactly, but out of something quieter than that, a kind of acknowledgement. He turned the corner, passed the water station, and stopped in front of Bay 14. The cat inside was curled against the back wall, which was where he had spent most of the past 5 days. Gray fur with patches of white across the chest and one front paw. Ears slightly flattened. Eyes half closed in that particular way that meant nothing at all. Neither rest nor alertness. Just a kind of withdrawal from everything around him. The tag on the bay read simply, "Male, gray and white. Estimated 8 to 10 years. No ID." Lysander opened the bay door quietly. He reached for the collar. A worn thing made of faded blue fabric, soft from long use. The kind of collar that had been on an animal for years rather than months. His fingers found the clasp and he began to work it loose gently. And then, he felt it. A slight stiffness along one seam. A small, deliberate thickness hidden in the lining of the fabric, protected by the doubled layer of cloth, as if someone had sewn it there with care. He paused. He turned the collar over in his hands. Along the inner edge, tucked between 2 layers of the worn fabric, there was a folded piece of paper. Small, creased, sealed against the material with a careful fold rather than tape or glue. The paper was old, not ancient, but old enough to have softened at the edges, to have taken on the slight warmth of something carried close for a long time. Lysander set the collar on the edge of the bay ledge. He unfolded the paper slowly, smoothing each crease carefully with his thumb, and he read the first line. He stopped. Behind him, the rain picked up slightly against the roof, a soft drumming that filled the silence. He stood very still for a moment, and then, without quite deciding to, he turned to look at the cat. The cat, who had not moved in days, who had pressed himself against the back wall with the determined stillness of an animal that has stopped expecting anything from the world, was standing. He had risen from his place, walked to the front of the bay, and was now looking directly into the corridor, his head lifted slightly, his amber eyes open and steady, watching something that was not there yet. Lysander looked at the paper in his hand, he looked at the cat, and he said quietly, to no one in particular, "His name is Orwell." The cat did not turn at the sound. He kept watching the corridor. And Lysander Hale, who had worked in this shelter for 11 years and prided himself on following the rules that kept it running, folded the paper carefully, placed it in the breast pocket of his uniform, and went to find Dr. Corvin Draxler. The 9 o'clock appointment would need to wait. The note was written in a hand that had once been elegant, the kind of handwriting taught in schools decades ago, when penmanship was considered worth the effort. The letters were slightly unsteady now, the way a person's handwriting becomes when their hands are not quite as reliable as they used to be. But the care was still visible in every word. It said, "His name is Orwell. He does not like loud voices. If someone speaks loudly near him, he will hide, and it may take an hour or more before he feels safe again. Please be patient with him. He is not unfriendly. He is only careful. He waits when it rains. I do not know why. He has always done this, ever since he was small. He goes to the nearest door and he waits, and I have learned not to question it. Some things about the ones we love we simply accept. If he stops eating, sit beside him. Do not stare at him. Do not make noise. Just be near. He will eat eventually if he knows he is not alone. He has never been able to eat when he feels alone. I suppose some of us are like that." And then the last line, slightly fainter than the rest, as if the pen had been running low, or the hand holding it had been trembling a little more than usual. "Please do not let him think he was forgotten." Lysander folded the note again, with great care, and returned it to his pocket. He thought about the hand that had written those words, the deliberateness of placing them inside the collar, protected from weather and time, in the hope that someone would find them. It was the act of a person who knew they were running out of options, but had not yet run out of effort. He went to warm a small portion of food. He brought it back to Bay 14, set it just inside the door, and sat down cross-legged on the floor, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd. He did not look at Orwell directly. He looked at the middle distance, at the faded paint on the opposite wall, at the slow movement of rain down the high window near the ceiling. After 14 minutes, Orwell walked to the food and ate, not quickly, not with any enthusiasm exactly, but steadily, in the way of an animal that has decided for now to keep going. That evening, when the shelter had grown quiet, Lysander sat at his desk and thought carefully about the note. Not its emotional weight, though that was present and real, but its practical contents. Someone had written these words. Someone who knew this cat deeply, who had watched him long enough to understand his habits, his fears, his small particular needs. That person had not chosen to abandon Orwell. The note was the opposite of abandonment. It was someone trying, from a distance they could not cross, to ensure that care continued, which meant there was a somewhere, and possibly a someone. He wrote down the address from the intake form. He would start there in the morning, but that night, before he turned off the light, he walked back to Bay 14 one more time. Orwell was not pressed against the back wall. He was lying near the front of the bay, facing the corridor, eyes half open in the dim light, still watching, still waiting, for something that hadn't arrived yet. The house at the end of Aldermore Street was the kind of place that holds its history quietly. 2 stories of aged white clapboard, a wide front porch, the kind built in a time when porches were meant to be used, when people sat outside in the evenings and watched the light change over the hills. On the porch, just to the right of the front door, there was a ceramic dish, faded blue, chipped at the rim, filled with the hardened remnants of what had once been cat food. Beside it, a small worn mat, bleached pale by seasons of sun and rain. Orwell had not been here by accident. This had been home. Lysander knocked on the door, though he already suspected no one would answer. No one did. He went around back. There was a wooden bench under an old oak tree, with bark worn smooth on the armrests, the kind of place that remembered being sat in. He noted the name on the mailbox, which had not yet been changed. Monsieur Whitfield. Back at the shelter that afternoon, a volunteer named Meridian Crow was already in Bay 14. Meridian was one of those people whose quiet steadiness makes them easy to overlook, until you realize, after paying attention for a while, that she was the person most things actually depended on. She had been volunteering at Brackenridge Hollow for 3 years, mostly with the older animals, the ones who required patience rather than charm. She had brought a blanket, a soft thing, pale green, the kind a person drapes over their lap on a cool evening without thinking much about it. She had set it on the floor of the bay, folded into a loose rectangle, and she was sitting beside it quietly. Orwell was standing at the edge of the bay, 3 feet from the blanket, not moving toward it, but not moving away. "He's been looking at it for about 8 minutes, Meridian said without turning around. "That sounds about right," Lysander said. They both waited. Orwell took 1 step toward the blanket, then another, then stopped again, as if reconsidering. Neither of them moved. Then, slowly, with the deliberate care of an older animal whose joints have opinions, he lowered himself onto the blanket, tucked his front paws under his chest, closed his eyes, and stayed. Neither of the humans spoke for a long moment. "First time he's looked comfortable," Meridian said finally quietly. "First time," Lysander agreed. He told her about the note, about Aldermore Street, about the porch dish, the worn mat, and the name on the mailbox. He told her his conviction, which had been growing steadily since Friday morning, that whatever had separated Orwell from the person who had written those words had not been a choice made freely on either side. Meridian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Monsieur Whitfield. That's all I have so far. It's somewhere to start." That evening, Lysander made calls. The neighbor who had brought Orwell in, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Pemberton, told him, in the careful way of someone sharing news they found sad, that the woman who had lived there, a Mrs. Maren Whitfield, had been taken by ambulance to a care facility in the town of Sallow Creek, about 40 miles east, following a health episode 6 weeks prior. It had happened quickly. There had been family, briefly, dealing with the house. But the cat, Mrs. Pemberton said, lowering her voice slightly, had already been outside when they arrived, and in the confusion of those first days, no one had thought to ask. No one had thought to ask. Lysander wrote a letter that night. He described the shelter. He described the intake. He described finding the note inside the collar. He wrote down everything the note said, every line, because he felt, without quite being able to explain it, that those words belonged to their author, and she deserved to hear them repeated back to her, to know they had been received. He sent it by express post on Monday morning. In the meantime, Orwell continued. This was the word Lysander found himself using, in his notes, in his conversations with Meridian, even in his own thinking. Not improving, not recovering, not thriving, simply continuing. Each day brought small adjustments, small moments that accumulated without announcing themselves. He ate consistently when Lysander sat near him. He had moved from the back wall to the middle of the bay, and now spent most of his time near the front, close to the gate, watching the corridor. When Meridian came in with the pale green blanket, he went to it within minutes. He still waited by the door when it rained. The call came on Wednesday, not from the facility itself, but from a staff coordinator named Paulette, who said she had received the letter, and that yes, there was a resident named Maren Whitfield, and that Mrs. Whitfield, when the letter was shared with her, had become very still for a moment, and then said one word, Orwell, just that, before Paulette had read another line. Paulette said she would need to arrange a supervised telephone call, but that Mrs. Whitfield had asked her to convey something in the meantime. She said to tell whoever wrote the letter that the note in his collar was the last thing she did before she left the house. Lysander sat very still at his desk. Outside, rain moved across the shelter roof. Down the hall, he knew without looking, Orwell was standing at the gate of Bay 14, watching the corridor, waiting with the particular patience of a creature who has decided, for reasons of his own, that waiting is worthwhile. She said she sewed it in herself with a needle and thread, Paulette continued, in case it came loose. She said she hoped someone would find it. A pause. She remembered everything about him. When I mentioned the rain, she smiled. She said yes, he always did that. She said she never knew why, but that it was one of her favorite things about him. Lysander was quiet for a moment. Tell her, he said softly, that he is still waiting. The telephone call was arranged for Friday. They set up a small speaker in the bay. Lysander and Meridian sat outside the open gate, not crowding the space, just present. Paulette connected the call from Sallow Creek. There was a moment of soft background sound, a chair shifting, the faint clink of a cup being set down. And then a voice, slightly thin with age, but carrying its own particular steadiness, came through the speaker. Hello, sweetheart. Orwell, who had been sitting near the front of the bay in his usual post, turned. He turned all the way around, away from the corridor he had been watching all week, and faced the speaker. His ears came forward. He walked to it slowly, the way he walked everywhere, with care and deliberateness. He stopped in front of it, and sat down. Lysander looked at Meridian. She was looking at Orwell with an expression he could not quite name, not quite smiling, something quieter than that. Maren Whitfield, 40 miles away, talked to her cat for 23 minutes. She talked about the weather, about the oak tree in the backyard, about a particular blanket she used to have that was almost the same green as the one Meridian had brought. She said she was sorry she hadn't been able to take him with her, that it had happened so fast, that she had thought about him every single day. She thanked Lysander by name. She thanked the person who had thought to bring a soft blanket. And she said, near the end, in a voice that had gone slightly quieter, he just needs to know someone is there. That's always been enough for him. When the call ended, Orwell sat in front of the silent speaker for another minute or two. Then he turned, walked back to the pale green blanket, curled himself onto it with the careful economy of a dignified older cat, and closed his eyes. The regulations at the facility were not unreasonable. In fact, they were quite thoughtful. Animal visits were allowed under specific conditions: calm, non-aggressive, supervised, subject to the resident's health status. But there was no provision for an animal to live within the facility. Lysander read this last part twice. Orwell could not stay with Maren. This was the wall they had reached, and it was a real one. He brought it to Meridian on a Thursday morning, 2 cups of coffee and the printed regulations between them. She can't take him, he said. No, and he can't stay at the shelter indefinitely. No. They sat with that for a moment. I've been thinking, Meridian said. She said it in the particular way of someone who has been thinking for a while but wanted to be certain before speaking. Lysander waited. He needs a permanent home, she said, with someone who understands him, who knows about the rain and the loud voices and the eating. A pause. And he needs to be close enough to Sallow Creek that visits are possible. That's 40 miles. That's manageable, she said, for someone who is willing. She looked at him steadily. Lysander put down his coffee. Meridian. I live 22 miles from Sallow Creek, she said. I looked it up. I have a spare room that I've been meaning to clear for 2 years. I have flexible hours. She paused. And I have spent enough time in that bay with that cat to know that I understand what he needs. Another pause. I am not doing this because it feels good in the moment. I have thought about it carefully. I would like to adopt Orwell. and I would like to bring him to visit Maren Whitfield regularly, with the facility's approval. Lysander was quiet for a moment. That is a significant commitment, he said. I know what it is. Corvin approved the adoption within the day. The visit to Sallow Creek was arranged for a Saturday afternoon in early November, when the air had gone crisp and the sky was that particular shade of clear gray that comes before the first cold weeks of the year. Orwell traveled in a soft-sided carrier lined with the pale green blanket. He was quiet the entire way. The facility smelled of warm tea and something faintly floral. The floors were pale wood. Footsteps sounded soft and unhurried. Maren Whitfield's room was small and quietly arranged. A photograph on the narrow dresser, a potted plant on the windowsill, a worn quilt folded over the back of the chair by the window, its pattern faded to soft blues and creams. Maren was sitting in that chair when they came in. She was smaller than Lysander had imagined, white hair pinned loosely back, hands resting still in her lap. But her eyes were clear and direct, and when the door opened, they went immediately to the carrier Meridian held. And she straightened slightly in her chair, the way a person straightens when something they have been waiting for is finally arriving. Meridian set the carrier down on the floor a few feet from the chair and opened the front. Orwell did not come out immediately. He sat inside for a moment, ears forward, taking in the room with the measured attention of an animal that makes decisions carefully. The afternoon light, the smell of the space, the sound of breathing in the room, the particular quality of the silence. Then he stepped out. He walked across the pale wood floor slowly. He stopped in front of Maren's chair and looked up at her. She looked down at him. Neither of them moved for a moment. And then Orwell rose onto his hind legs, placed his front paws on the edge of the chair seat, and pressed the top of his head against her folded hands. Maren Whitfield made a sound that was not quite a word. Her hands unfolded and came to rest gently on his gray and white fur. She sat very still, with her eyes closed, and the room was quiet enough that the sound of wind moving past the window was clearly audible, carrying with it the first soft suggestion of rain. Lysander stood near the door and looked at his shoes. Meridian stood beside him and did not say anything. The months that followed did not unfold without difficulty, because nothing that involves real lives and real logistics ever does. There were weeks when Meridian's schedule made the drive to Sallow Creek hard to fit in. She made it anyway. There were weeks when Maren was not well enough for a visit. Meridian sent photographs instead. Paulette would show them on a tablet, and Maren would look at them with the particular expression of someone holding something carefully. And Orwell changed, slowly, quietly, in small ways that accumulated. He stopped pressing himself to the back of whatever space he was in. He began to accept the presence of other people without going still and remote. He still waited at the door when it rained, but with less urgency, as if the waiting had become habit rather than desperation. And then, on an afternoon in early spring, Meridian was sitting in the front room of her house, reading. The rain began. She looked up, expecting to see Orwell at the front door, in his familiar post. He was not at the door. He was on the cushion beside her on the couch, eyes half closed, front paws tucked under his chest, entirely still. The rain fell. He did not move. She set her book down and looked at him for a moment. He opened his eyes briefly, met hers with the measured amber gaze she had come to know well, and closed them again. She picked her book back up. Outside, the rain continued its soft conversation with the roof and the grass and the bare branches of the tree in the front yard. Inside, a woman sat reading, and a gray and white cat rested beside her, both of them warm and unhurried and present. There was a note sewn into a worn blue collar that had started all of this, written in a careful, unsteady hand by a woman who had not given up, even when giving up would have been the easier thing. It had asked, in its last line, for one thing only: Not rescue exactly, and not a miracle. Something smaller, something more durable than either. Please do not let him think he was forgotten. He had not been forgotten. He had been found by someone who stopped to read, passed to someone who stayed, and brought back to someone who remembered. He had crossed 40 miles twice, sitting in a soft carrier lined with a pale green blanket, and had placed his paws on the hands of the person he had been waiting for. And on an ordinary spring afternoon, with rain on the roof and someone beside him, he had stopped waiting. Because some creatures wait their whole lives for proof that staying is worthwhile. Orwell had found his proof, and he had decided, at last, to rest.